Our story begins on December 11th, 2019, with a public spat between the National Weather Service and one Justin Spiro. Justin had been maintaining a New York City Weather Alerts Facebook page since 2015, the purpose of which was to interpret weather reports and make predictions. 4 years in, he had a pretty good handle on weather in the city. When the National Weather Service called for 2 to 3 inches of snow accumulation in New York, Justin brought them to task, claiming in a reply,
"This seems a bit bullish. The roads will be so warm from today's 50s, and the low is forecast to be in the mid-30s. Do you think urban streets will really see any accumulating snow?"
Somebody at the National Weather Service promptly replied, "Hi, Justin. We don't forecast for accumulating snow on roadways. We are thinking it will accumulate on grassy/colder surfaces." Justin took a screenshot of the tweet exchange and posted it to Justin's NYC Weather Alerts with the caption,
"The official National Weather Service forecast calls for 2 inches of snow for NYC, but I just don't see how anything will accumulate on city streets after a day of 50s and rain. And the low won't even get below 34. I challenged the NWS on this, and they conceded the point. See below. However, be careful nonetheless. This in a sense could be a more dangerous situation. With the roads mostly wet, we may let our guard down. Watch for isolated snowy or icy spots, especially on untreated back roads and sidewalks. Other than that, enjoy the non-accumulating flakes."
The next morning, he posted this video.
Good morning, everyone. Just before 6 a.m. here in Midtown Manhattan, and our forecast panned out. As you'll see, looking around, it looks like a rainy day. It is snowing. We saw a salt truck just come by, put some salt down here on 7th Avenue, but there's really no need. It's 33 degrees, the coldest it's been. The snow's getting a little lighter now, actually. And look at some cars, look at some grassy spots. You might have like a slushy, half an inch or so, but as we predicted, there wouldn't be anything on the ground in the city. So for those who say we always hype, we actually have the most accurate forecast. If you watch the major, mainstream media weather channels, they will give they're saying a wide swath of 2 to 3 inches. They do not give a New York City specific forecast. They don't understand that the city operates differently in the suburbs, although I'd venture to guess that even in many suburbs today, you're not seeing much in terms of accumulation. So when they say 2 inches, they don't specify that means grassy surfaces, that means grassy suburban surfaces. What we care about is how is this going to affect our commute. And if you're driving down 49th Street today, it might as well be raining. Everything is melting, it hits the ground. Now, as I said last night, there definitely could be some slippery spots where, overpasses, bridges are usually a little colder than other places. So as you walk, take care. There could be some icy spots. But it was 55 degrees last night, and it hasn't gone below freezing yet, at least in the city. So enjoy your uneventful Wednesday morning commute, and stay tuned, though, because some real wintry weather will be on the horizon.
The grand total of engagement between the video and the post that preceded it, along with another post from the evening of the 11th, in which he suggested a real winter storm might be upon them in about a week and a half, came to 36 likes, 13 comments, and 2 shares. Not altogether unimpressive numbers for a Facebook page reinterpreting predictions from the National Weather Service, but one could hardly call Justin a public figure. Little did he know, as he went to bed that night, an opportunity was waiting just around the corner, 3 months away to be exact, that would launch his star further than he could have possibly imagined. Hey everybody, it's Noah, and you're listening to another episode of Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. Today's episode is entitled Justin Spiro, or How a Twitter Reply Guy Became the Maskless Face of Public Schools. I think it's important to mention right off the bat that some of the subject matter we'll be diving into today has been tainted in the public debate by misinformation and bad data. Even the discussion itself, in many cases, is oriented around straw man arguments that we will identify in the hopes of refocusing the debate on far more important terms and considerations that have been overshadowed by these cleverly constructed diversions. One last thing I should mention up front is that we are trying something new this week by releasing this episode in 2 parts. Instead of releasing a short teaser of an episode for the full episode found exclusively on Patreon, this will be a 2-parter, with the first part here on the free feed and the second part found at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. The idea behind that, aside from trying something new, is that this is particularly pressing, time-sensitive stuff that we didn't want to restrict behind a paywall. If you want the full experience, though, be sure to check out patreon.com/professionaldevelopment for the second half of the episode and the full backlog of Patreon-exclusive episodes as well. Justin Spiro. If you follow New York City public school-related news, you probably met him recently as the Take the Masks Off the Children guy. If you've been following this stuff for a bit longer, you might know him as the No More Remote Instruction guy. Before that, he was just an LCSW, or a licensed clinical social worker, working in the New York City DOE. He had his weather prediction page, of course, but that was more of a hobby. Justin's true passion was born of some collection of innate character traits that, in the era of social media, expressed themselves in forcing their host to become a reply guy. I realize that this show has a cross-generational listener base, which I think is wonderful, so I will take a moment to borrow a definition for the reply guy from dictionary.com. A reply guy is a term for a man who frequently comments on tweets or other social media posts in an annoying, condescending, forward, or otherwise unsolicited manner, especially posts by women. It can also refer to a person who frequently and zealously responds to posts from famous people on Twitter. Here are Justin's replies from just the past week while we've been on break. Randy Weingarten posted a link to an article on February 24th along with the caption, "Interesting poll, California voters strongly support mask and vaccine mandates in K-12 schools." Justin's reply,
Randy, you are the leader of the largest teacher union in America. This is a dangerous tweet without further context. Do you personally support indefinite mask and vaccine mandates for kids in 2022, after every adult has had access to 3 shots for months?
Dr. Leanna Wen posted on February 23rd, new study shows that COVID school closures affected cognitive and motor development in preschoolers. Learning loss is most pronounced in kids most at risk. Justin's response,
You forgot to say, and I apologize deeply for contributing to this through my 18 months of fear-mongering about schools.
David Love posted on February 23rd, I switched schools before the 2020 to 2021 school year. I've never taught these kids unmasked. It's fine.
It's one thing to disagree about removing mask mandates, but for a teacher to gaslight and deny any harms of mandatory masking is outrageous and show a real lack of empathy.
Randy Weingarten posted a photo from a read aloud she did, along with the caption, "Part of the joy of reading is actually learning to read. These students are going to have these books at home that they can read and enjoy with their families." Justin's reply,
A book that focuses on the letter B. Were you able to demonstrate to the kids how to make the B sound by pushing your lips together? Do you think the benefit of you masking a boosted adult with Omicron antibodies outweighs the benefit of demonstrating the letter B?
On February 22nd, Randy Weingarten just posted the date, 2/22/22. Justin's reply,
Cute date, yes, but also a reminder. that it's not 2020 anymore. Students were forced to learn behind a Zoom screen for 18 months and behind a mask for 6 more. The adult world is living normally in 2022. It's time to let kids join them. Unmask our children.
Dr. Esther Chu posted 10 weeks of summer, 4 kids with no overlapping interests. Let camp planning Sudoku begin on February 21st. Justin's reply:
Your children are lucky to have you as a mother. As you make school policy recommendations, please remember not all kids have such caring and attentive parents. Think about the kids who don't see smiles at home and suffer terribly under remote. Kids need normal school now.
Jonathan Reiner posted, daily cases are dropping rapidly in the US, but we still have more people hospitalized and dying than we did during that terrible first spring and summer of the pandemic. How do we declare a return to normal when over 2,000 people are dying every day? On February 21st, Justin's reply:
Because preventing children and vaccinated adults from living normally won't save lives. The deaths are almost all unvaccinated adults and unboosted seniors. We should definitely continue vaccine outreach, but we can't save people who refuse to protect themselves.
Dr. Esther Chu again on February 20th, in church and going mental over those not wearing masks, even though we have a congregant in the ICU with COVID right now and at least 30% of attendees are elderly. Here's Justin's reply.
This is a dangerous message from a public health official. As schools become mask optional, tweets like these will encourage shaming and bullying of maskless children.
So there is a pattern here. Justin really likes to reply to Randy Weingarten, who's the president of the AFT, and Dr. Esther Chu, a doctor and public health expert. At least in the past week or so, while we were on break. There was a time in the history of social media in which a reply guy on Twitter would remain a reply guy on Twitter. But unfortunately, we live in something of a hellscape in which social media and real life intermingle, and being a vociferous enough reply guy will earn one a large enough following on Twitter to catch the eye of journalists who, it would seem, begin and sometimes end their reporting with a Google search. This is how reply guy Justin begins to emerge from the internet and very quickly take his final form as the one person working in schools who will speak against health and safety protocols in schools. Here he is back in July of 2021 in a New York One report on the vaccine mandate.
We can never do that again. So if the vaccine mandate is one way to assure that there'll be fewer quarantines, hopefully no quarantines next year, then I am all for it.
I anticipate you might be thinking, Noah, you brought me all the way back to July for this? It's pretty mild stuff. And generally speaking, we were all in agreement with what Justin's saying here. A vaccine mandate helps us stay safe and keep each other safe. So why are we looking at this? The issue is in the subtext. When referring to remote instruction, he says we can never do that again. So the problem in Justin's retelling of the 2020 to 2021 school year is the offer of remote instruction as a mitigation effort against the spread of COVID. That message comes through more clearly in this op-ed that he wrote for the New York Daily News in the same month.
March 2020. Schools close until April 20th, and I worry how my depressed and anxious students will manage at home for the next 5 weeks. As we flatten the curve on this novel virus, will they feel comfortable returning to school after so many weeks at home? Little did we know. July 2020. I'm working in a regional enrichment center with children of first responders, and I see how desperate the students are to speak with someone after 3 months at home. Though I am a stranger, students of all ages readily open up about their mental health struggles through the first months of COVID. Above all, they feel so happy to be heard and validated, and they rejoice at simple peer interactions previously taken for granted. Their smiles, even behind masks, are infectious. I eagerly await the start of the school year, knowing I will have so much work to do with my own students reeling from nearly half a year away from the classroom. I both anxiously and excitedly await the onslaught of counseling demand in September. But it was not to be. The start of the school year was delayed until October, but it never truly began in earnest. Due to strict social distancing requirements, high schools were only able to offer students 3 hours of in-person instruction once or twice per week. School became a skeleton of its former self, and under these conditions, a majority of students understandably chose remote learning. As a school social worker, my effectiveness is contingent on interacting with students in their natural environment. I can observe which students appear sad as they enter the building, get into arguments with their teacher in class, sit alone during lunchtime, or caught vaping in the bathroom. But it is not enough to have every student present. We must have every student present every day. I implore Mayor de Blasio to adopt Centers for Disease Control guidance stating that 3 feet of social distancing can be waived in order to accommodate all students. Likewise, classroom quarantines should end per the CDC's exemption of classmates as close contacts. Students need consistency. Socially anxious teens often struggle with coming back after a long weekend. A series of 10-day quarantines could completely torpedo the academic and emotional well-being of many students. There is a tidal wave coming. I fully expect a torrent of trauma and mental health crises to crest on the shores of every public school this fall. A year and a half is a lifetime for a teenager, and this was not a normal year and a half. They lost family members to COVID, witnessed a nationwide racial reckoning inspired by George Floyd, endured economic hardships at home. How many students have unresolved grief? How many are not eating 3 meals a day? How many have been masking, pun intended, depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts? How many have experienced abuse or neglect? Research suggests the problems are profound. The path back to normalcy will not be easy, but we've got this. As long as schools open in full, we can assess and intervene with every student in need. We can ensure that students receive the mental health care they need. We can finally do the job we love, as it was intended. Sept. 13, 2021. The school doors will swing wide open, and they must never close again.
There it is. Exactly what ended up happening this year. The remote option effectively taken off the table, and every single child back in school every day. A full return to normalcy. Except, of course, that many children and families were rightfully concerned about a full return to in-person learning without real, meaningful COVID mitigation. So a lot of kids didn't come back into the building. In this new paradigm, which was meant to resemble school in 2019, there were some schools on some days with under 50% attendance. Quarantines, resulting from outbreaks of the virus, made consistency impossible, and the lack of consistent remote infrastructure meant that lessons and days were just lost for some students. So what was the problem with Justin's plan? He wasn't wrong that the 2020 to 2021 school year was difficult for students. I'll add that it was difficult for teachers, too. The central thesis of his op-ed is that it's really hard to do his job remotely, and he's not wrong. Unfortunately, he's identified the wrong culprit here. When analyzing the failings of remote learning, we shouldn't be looking at remote learning itself as the source of these failings, because that would be to assume that in-person learning is flawless. It turns out in-person learning and remote learning share a lot of the same failings, but remote learning amplifies them. Remote learning, then, is like a magnifying glass, showing us what has been wrong with our education system all along. The problem is horrific inequities in the distribution of resources in this city and in this country, and the fact that public education is functioning as the duct tape preventing a comprehensive collapse of our society. Everybody with whom I've spoken has a few remote instruction success stories. Some students handled it really well, maybe even better than they would have handled in-person instruction in a COVID-free school year. So it's not that remote instruction is inherently broken in and of itself. A lot of the students who did well had a quiet space in their home in which to work. Space is a resource, and a particularly costly one in the city. Students who had fast internet and reliable devices had an advantage too. Those are obviously resources as well. Even with the DOE mediating access to devices, some students ended up with old, broken Chromebooks and no access to a tech support contact at the school, while others ended up with a brand new device and a teacher dedicated solely to keeping the tech infrastructure working. It was a question of which school within the DOE a student attended as to what kinds of resources they could access. Students whose parents were available during the day to support their learning had an advantage as well, and time is perhaps one of the costliest resources of them all. In-person instruction does not ameliorate these imbalances in resource distribution, though. We might have removed the magnifying glass from the source of the problem. We might have taken a pain reliever for a brief cessation of symptoms, but the disease continues to spread. Hold on to this idea because we're not done with it, but it's time now for us to fast forward a bit. Justin's Twitter feed really came to life in late July, around the time he appeared on New York One and published his op-ed. He established himself as something of a bad guy wrestler. If anybody needed somebody working in a school who would also testify that remote instruction was the enemy of children's mental health and social and emotional development, he was the guy. If anybody needed somebody working in a school to badmouth the union, but for doing too much to protect students and teachers, he was the guy. If, as a journalist, you needed to make the case that educators wanted something that they didn't actually want, namely fewer efforts at COVID mitigation in schools, you needed only to follow Justin because he was the only game in town. For a while, business was good. The follows, the likes, they just kept rolling in. People love a bad guy wrestler for mixing up some controversy. Some people, too, misunderstand the narrative arc and like a bad guy wrestler because they think he's the good guy. Those people are able to like and follow just as well as the other type of people, so Justin was able to put together a pretty solid following, including the likes of media personalities and journalists that would help to amplify his message even further. The stage was thus set for Justin to have a little too much influence in our present moment, in which a manufactured debate rages between anti-maskers and most school stakeholders. Remember, he's not a public health expert. He's not a doctor. He's not a teacher. He's not even licensed to be around more than 8 kids at once in his work in school, which means he is not exposed to the kinds of risk most of us teachers are. I, for example, am really lucky in that I only see about 25 kids at once in my assigned classes, but I see about 200 different students over the course of 3 days in a room without windows and filters that haven't been changed since they were installed. Yet Justin, having developed a following and grabbed as much media attention as he could, became the stand-in for educators in addressing the Urgency of Normal Advocacy Toolkit and media campaign. If you haven't heard of the Urgency of Normal campaign, then it's not too late to turn off the show and preserve your sanity. But if you are in this for the long haul, strap in, and I'll read a bit from the New Republic, which did an excellent job covering it as the junk that it is, as well as all of the experts who came out to debunk the data referenced by its authors. The following comes from Melody Schreiber's February 22nd, 2022 article, "Why is this group of doctors so intent on unmasking kids? The physicians and scientists of the Urgency of Normal are cherry-picking data in their push to end pandemic precautions, but are getting favorable mainstream media attention and support from wealthy white communities that never felt the full brunt of COVID-19. Since the pandemic began, everyone has longed to get back to normal. For parents in particular who faced long waits to get children over 5 vaccinated and whose hopes were recently crushed by the announcement that the under 5 vaccine would be delayed, there has been little reprieve. We worry about everything. How safe are their play dates and school days? Do face masks affect their development? Will they be the unlucky ones, the sobering footnotes in every story who face severe illness or death? Every parent wants the same thing: a healthy, stable future for our kids. We want to put the stress and pain of the pandemic behind us. But the past few weeks have shown that there is stark disagreement on the best path to a new normal. While the pandemic still rages with 25% of children 5 to 11 and a little more than half of 12 to 17-year-olds vaccinated, a vocal minority of physicians and scientists has called for the end of precautions. Some of them, organized in a movement they call the urgency of normal, are finding an eager audience in those who have largely been spared the worst of the pandemic. The group says the precautions, more than the pandemic itself, are causing mental strain and potential harms to children. If the precautions are lifted, kids can return to normal. Public health experts, meanwhile, point to what they say is a huge flaw in this reasoning. Removing precautions before meeting various vaccination, treatment, and caseload benchmarks could let the virus spread unchecked, develop more dangerous variants, and put normal out of reach for much, much longer. There is, to be clear, little scientific disagreement about what helps quell the pandemic. Vaccinations, masks, ventilation, tests, staying home while sick, these layers of protection, when employed, are highly effective at keeping the virus from spreading, which is especially urgent with 109,000 daily cases, 2,000 daily deaths, and many hospitals still at capacity. The science is strong, but this movement to drop pandemic precautions is about something else entirely, a potent mix of pandemic fatigue, politics, individualistic thinking, and, if both polling and pandemic statistics are to be believed, a persistent divide based on class and race. Schreiber continues, Tyler Black, a child and adolescent psychiatrist and suicidologist at BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver, hadn't heard anything about the urgency of normal group or its toolkit until it came out. But when he saw it go up on Twitter, he was appalled. Their document was so poor, with so many mistakes, that it required immediate public correction, he said. He messaged some of the signers directly on Twitter, he said, and when no one responded, he went public in a detailed Twitter thread that focused on his area of expertise, child mental health. Several other subject area experts did the same, debunking comparisons to the flu and diving into the dismissal that many kids are fine. The central problem, he saw, was that the group claimed that masks harm children's mental health and social development, something he's seen no evidence for in his own work. It was really, really gross to see what they did with the mental health science. It's a true perversion of what science communication is supposed to be, Black said. They had miscited the CDC. I'm not talking about they made a mistake. I'm talking about misciting. Academic misconduct. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention study found that there was no significant increase in child suicide, yet the group used that study to claim the opposite, an increase in suicide. After pushback, the authors edited the toolkit to remove that mention of suicide, he said, without noting what had been revised. Early data in the pandemic did show increased signs of distress among children, Black said. Of course you would expect those to be increasing during a distressing time. If we deployed the same surveys during a funeral, we would conclude that funerals also cause harm to kids, he said. Longer-term data largely found no significant rise in child mental health disorders in the United States. The exception is eating disorders, which seem to be on the rise. But there's little evidence of what exactly is driving the rise. Early data indicate no link with remote or in-person school, for instance. Suicides among kids in the U.S. did not increase during the first year of the pandemic. In fact, during early months, they decreased. There was a spike in suicide attempts in January 2021 when some schools resumed in-person or hybrid learning. But the return to school is often a stressful time for kids, Black said. It's this noticeable pattern for anyone who works in child mental health that we are busiest during school time. The bottom line about kids' mental health in the pandemic, Black said, is that when we ask kids, just as many say that they're doing better as say that they're doing worse. And most kids say that their mental health has not changed during the pandemic. Black is concerned that the authors of the Urgency of Normal toolkit may be miscommunicating the evidence on other topics as well. They're picking the science that makes their point, and that, by the very definition, is extremely biased, unreliable science. Given that the research on masking is pretty favorable to mandates, especially during times of high transmission, the downsides of masking increasingly look political. But even when it comes to politics, anti-maskers run into data problems. Polls show overwhelming support for mask mandates. In a poll from August, 70% of respondents say they supported mandates in schools. In September, before the Omicron wave, a different poll found 66% of Americans supported school mask mandates. This support is particularly strong when case numbers are high. A poll just last month in January found 68% of respondents support mandates during a surge, while another from December found only 28% of families wanted in-person school without masks during a COVID wave. Why then are groups like the Urgency of Normal getting so much press? Why are so many stories in the nation's elite media publications echoing the call for precautions to end? One answer might lie in whom, specifically, these groups and these pieces are reaching. The places that could actually attain a sense of normalcy are overwhelmingly high-income, white communities that have long been insulated from the worst effects of the pandemic. And these are the locations with the most support for lifting precautions. What is striking to me is that they've actually not incurred the costs of the pandemic to a large degree. Lakshmi Ganapati, a pediatric infectious disease physician at Harvard Medical School, told me. The rhetoric around the demand for normalcy among those from high-income communities, she added, suggests that they are the ones who are suffering, when, with objective data, we can see that other communities have suffered even more. Not long after the Urgency of Normal campaign kicked off, Justin and two other people launched a parallel project called Educators for Normalcy, which is essentially a shell social media presence and Google Doc that anybody can fill out to have their name or pseudonym attached to the website, just like one could do with the Urgency of Normal site. One of the other people working with Justin on this thing is called Dr. Adam Phillips, and he released this video on Twitter via somebody named Natalia, who seems to be grifting to make a documentary film about the harmful effects of masks on children. Let me make sure that came across clearly. She is not collecting donations to make a documentary about the children who died of COVID or the 5 million children worldwide who lost their caregivers to COVID, but about the harmful effects of masks on children. Anyway, here's the video clip.
Hi, I'm Dr. Adam Phillips, one of the authors of this letter advocating for an end to COVID mitigation strategies in our schools, both now and in the future. As a teacher of 18 years of experience in the public schools in North Carolina, as a school coach, and as a school bus driver, I encourage you to take a moment of your time to sign this letter to show policymakers of the wide level of support among educators, as well as parents, as well as students, for a return to normalcy in our schools. I just went out on a beautiful Sunday morning run. I love the ability to have the freedom of choice, and our students and our educators in our schools deserve the same. Please sign up today.
I tried to find out what kind of doctor Adam Phillips is, and as best as I can tell, he got a Juris Doctorate from Concord Law School back in 2016, Concord being the first fully online law school in the US. I certainly won't throw shade at someone for picking up extra degrees, but this guy certainly isn't presenting himself like the holder of a doctorate in this video. He didn't get a colleague to proofread his statement, which he ought to have done. He is bringing up his having gone for a run before the video, which doesn't seem to be in any way connected to his argument. And what a funny thing to list off teacher, coach, and bus driver as if it means you get 3 signatures on the petition. Anyway, the other of the three principal signatories on the website, Vanessa Steinkamp, is listed as a 2002 recipient of the James Madison Fellowship. She also seems to have run for city council in Colleyville, Texas back in 2019 and got lambasted online by some guy claiming she was only pretending to be a conservative Republican but was actually a leftist in disguise. The author of that fringe blog post had very strong reply guy energy, so I didn't dig much further. If what he said was true, then I would certainly doff my cap at such righteous subterfuge. But now that Steinkamp's political advocacy includes co-signing this rubbish, I can't help but think her reply guy got her all wrong, or she's gone so deep undercover as to have perhaps gone native in the libertarian camp. I'll hold out hope that in a few weeks she'll come out as having been pulling everybody's leg the whole time, but I can't really picture the end game in that sort of long con. But speaking of a con, let's get back to New York, where on Monday, February 28th, students and staff returning to NYC DOE schools will no longer be required to wear masks outdoors. I suspect that a lot of us in schools have already seen pretty unrestricted outdoor spaces around the building. There have been little engagement gathering posts on social media, of course, about children being punished for their masks falling down at recess, but I just don't have any firsthand or even secondhand experience of that being a thing. So I have a reason to doubt it. The real question, though, is when will indoor masking in schools cease to be a requirement? Really, that question could be restated as when will the final protection be removed for immunocompromised teachers and students? When will the last effort at COVID mitigation be declared a failure, forcing students who are unvaccinated, not by choice, but because their guardians refuse permission, to be fully exposed to whatever COVID is lurking in the air, waiting to hop into their unprotected respiratory systems? In New York, the majority of people surveyed by the Siena College Research Institute a couple of weeks ago wanted to wait to lift the school mask mandate. This is not the picture you get in the news, however. In between coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is a depiction of an even split between those who want a mask mandate and those who not only want masks to be a choice, but also for those who choose not to wear masks to be protected from the social consequences that come with willfully exposing those around you to greater risk of COVID infection. I do not know a single teacher who wants to be without the personal protection of a mask and the communal protection that widespread masking affords. Let me be clear that I'm not saying teachers like to wear masks. We pretty much universally hate it. It's a long day wearing a mask and having to project one's voice over classes for hours at a time. And again, I'll remind you that even this is something Justin doesn't have to do. But we want the students to be safe, and we want ourselves to be safe, and we want our people at home to be safe, so we are grateful for the layer of protection, insufficient though it may be, that a mask affords. Justin's argument, of course, is that we cannot go on like this forever, that we have to return to normal sometime. I would reiterate that the pre-pandemic normal really only worked for some students, some families, some teachers. We got a really clear picture of the most operative factors at play in the success or failure of public education when we went remote. And the premature return to in-person was not only ill-advised, as it has certainly prolonged the pandemic by getting a lot of us sick, and might very well have been the choice that killed at least one public school student. But perhaps even more sinister than that, it was a transparent attempt to divert our attention from those most operative factors. As long as we are debating remote versus in-person, we are not talking about what it will take to ensure all children have what they need both in school and out of school. As long as this strawman debate over masks is constructed by conservative think tanks and implemented by any random Twitter user craving the limelight or some other more sinister form of remuneration, we lose the airtime needed to have much more difficult conversations about social justice and the complicity of policymakers in depriving children of their right to education. Justin wears like a badge of honor the fact that he was blocked by More UFT and Solidarity on Twitter. But remember that these are the two caucuses arguably most focused on social justice in schools. What does that say about you as a reply guy, that you are blocked by the social justice caucuses? The other of the two main prongs of Justin's argument for removing the mask mandate in public schools is that vaccination is widely available and it works. I take that a little personally, as someone who got COVID in school through a cloth mask with both vaccinations and a booster. I was sick in bed for 5 days and stuck isolating in a room to keep my partner from getting sick for the full 10. And that's me, someone who commutes to work every day by either biking or running, who eats a moderately healthy vegetarian diet, and who has no real health complaints other than a stiff neck from spending too much time at the computer. It was a miserable few days, but I made it. Other people in schools, both students and staff, and their family members, have not been so lucky. Just recently, the data on per-school vaccination rates became publicly available. As of Sunday afternoon, the average rate of students with at least one dose of the vaccine, so not necessarily 2, not necessarily 3, just 1 minimum, was 59.3%. There are schools sitting at 12%. As far as I'm concerned, this prong no longer has any validity. We are a public school system. Students are required by law to attend in person, as there is no real remote alternative, which means ACS can get involved when parents make the choice to keep their children safe at home. Children require permission from their caregivers to get the vaccine, which means that it does not matter how readily available the vaccine is, nor how effective. Some children do not have the option, nor do they have the option to stay home and avoid infection that way. Removing the mask mandate removes their only protection, and that is unconscionable. If Justin really cared about every child's mental health and social and emotional development, as he purports to, he would be engaging in the harder conversations about more comprehensive changes to our educational system. I'm talking about more teachers, more support staff, smaller class sizes, better food, replacing high-stakes tests with more authentic forms of assessment, strengthening arts programming, just to name a few big ones. Rather than chasing the limelight by making himself available to stand in for educators and spout nonsense in an effort to construct a straw man that distracts from these conversations. Is it just the easy limelight that drives him to advocate in opposition to the interests of the immunocompromised teachers and students whose caregivers won't give them permission to get vaccinated? Is this the obvious outcome of Justin's NYC weather alerts never fully taking off? Or might there be some other incentive lying beneath the surface? So concludes part 1 of episode 30 of Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. For part 2 of the episode, in which we recall the story of how Justin managed to shut down a panel on health and safety in public schools by pestering Randy Weingarten in typical reply guy fashion, head on over to patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. We'll also check back in with Dr. Lucy McBride and explore her connections to the Koch family. These, of course, become Justin's connections tangentially when he parrots her unsupported arguments. With that, thank you so much for hanging out, and if we don't see you at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment, then we'll catch you next week.